So my name's Natasha Munasinghe. I run a company called Frank. We're a training and education company, and we work a lot with graduates, young professionals, to really prepare you for the future of work. I'm super excited because we've been wanting to cover this topic on data for so long. And I'm super excited that we get to speak to Benedict on why it's important for graduates to develop this skill set. And also, I haven't been to a hairdresser. That's my pre-COVID haircut. So I'm working on coming to a post-COVID haircut. So I wanted to introduce Benedict Benoit. He's the area vice president at a company called Calibra, and we're going to find out a little bit about what he does and what the company does. In terms of his experience, he's got 12 plus years customer-facing experience across a lot of different continents. He's definitely built an international and global career, works a lot with data, very savvy with data. In the US, worked in the Walters Clover Financial Services company, did a Master of Liberal Arts in Harvard University, and has a passion for opening new markets and really growing international markets. So today we're really going to focus Benedict's brain on sort of data literacy and how we can all develop it. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to really talk a little bit through on Benedict's own career story. I really love finding out how people have ended up where what they're doing now. We're going to talk about why data is important for graduates and for all of us, myself included. Data is a new thing. It's not something I studied. My background's in law, for instance. And so if we're trying to understand data and its relevance to all of us in different professions, how do we do that? How do we build our confidence around that? Today's focus is really on graduates and students, but also, of course, staff who are empowering graduates and students. So let me just stop share now. And thank you for everyone that also just joined in. Benedict, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let me start off with sort of, I've given the headlines on your career in terms of what you do, but talk us through sort of, you're in Melbourne now, but you started off somewhere else. How have you ended up in terms of your own journey?
Yeah, that's right. Interesting journey. I'm actually Belgian, from Belgium. I started as a developer, so I studied basically software engineering in school and started out as a developer in a bank. Now, I only did that for about a year and a bit, and I quickly realized that people in consulting were making somehow much more money than any developer did. So I was like, well, let me try that for a bit. So I moved into the consulting side of the business quite quickly. And, moving into that, we were working with banks, international banks primarily, and heavily focused on accounting, risk, and compliance in the bank. So all of those are very heavy data areas, if you will. There's a lot of data around there. Some are a bit more tech savvy than others, but I primarily stayed on the technical sides of the journey, if you will, and did that for about 10 years. I was fortunate enough that brought me to quite a few countries, including Asia, Australia, the US, and so on. But while doing that, I explored something called pre-sales, solution engineering, sometimes called, and that's really helping salespeople, right? Helping salespeople articulate and match what the product can do for the organization. That's what pre-sales people do. And I did that for a while in Asia, and before moving into the US, and then kind of moved to the US doing that as well. That's where I joined Calibra. That's about 6 years ago now, a little bit longer actually, as a pre-sale. So again, in that similar function, but now rather than working in the banks, we were working specifically in the data space, and we'll talk about what Calibra does here in a second, but in the data space across industries. So not just financial organizations. While being there, I basically said, well, hang on, it appears that I can do what those salespeople are doing. That seems easy. And so let me try that. And that's how I ended up in sales, and found out that it's not that easy to do, fortunately. But, that went quite well. And about 4 years ago, I moved from Boston into Australia to set up Calibra in Australia. So that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years. So first in a sales capacity, and then more recently in managerial functions across the board. We're approximately 25 people, 22 people now in Australia across different functions. So that's what I've been up to.
And so what does Calibra do? Give us a 30-second pitch.
Yeah, good question. Look on our website, and our mission would be we're changing the way organizations work with data so they can change the world, that they are more effective in doing what they're doing well, and that's helping the world in some way. We achieve that by something called data intelligence, and data intelligence is really connecting the right data with the right people in a compliant manner so that they can use that data to do something. No, more practically, what does that mean? Imagine you join a big organization tomorrow, right? And you're looking for customer data. It's not that easy, right? It's everywhere. We don't know where the golden copy is and what have you. So we help the organization to find the data they have, understand it, right? Put it into context, and then trust it. So how good is the quality? Who owns it? Certain things that aid with that trust, and then they can basically get access and do something what they're doing well.
And so, I mean, one of the reasons we have these webinars, Benedict, I told you when we spoke on the phone, is that there was a perception in awareness between what students thought they need in terms of skills and what employers thought the skills that were needed. So one of those big skills really was this confidence and understanding around data, no matter what profession we were. So whether it was law, accounting, engineering, education, there was still some way where data was coming into our world, and we need to kind of get a grasp around it, right? So, let me start with like the basic question is what do you think being data literate is these days in professions, particularly if you're not even studying anything related to data?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and really to kind of understand why companies need that skill, I think we kind of have to go 30 years back. Right, 30 years back, there was a bit of a shift with the notion of business process reengineering, right? And Six Sigma arrived, right? And that was most famously practiced by what's his name, Jack Welch from GE, right? And really, what it did, it changed the way that people or organizations looked at processes, right? And in the meantime, it's been applied to all organizations in Fortune 500, I believe, right? And it wasn't done by mistake, right? It was a movement, a revolution that happens in organizations. And there were early practitioners, right? And then ultimately you build a base of people that are doing it, and then people get training and certification in it all across the company, right? And that's exactly where data is in a similar fashion, right? It's a movement, right? So data was used in companies back in the day, right? But it's more prominent now, when rather than a couple of people in an organization, it's expected that everyone talks the same language, the data language, right? Everyone can make decisions based on data. Just like the workers, in the 1990s, people are unsure, right? They don't know what process reengineering is. That's where most companies are. They're unsure. They're not sure how to use data, and they're basically trying to include data in that, the trifecta of people, process, and technology, and how to leverage data in a more efficient way for doing that. Right.
And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I was going to say, and that's where data literacy comes in, right? It's about being able to communicate with data on different levels within the organization.
So if you're just coming into an organization, let's say you're a graduate and you sort of young professional, how do you sort of start learning? How do you get a grasp of it, particularly if it's not something you study in a degree?
Yeah, so there's different ways that, and different tools that people use to kind of do it. But let's take one step back just slightly, because with the emergence of data analytics and AI and so on, machine learning as core elements of that, of digital kind of company, we expect people to communicate with data. Now, what does that mean, right? Because it's not just working with data, right? Open Excel and you can start working with data, and we'll get back to that. But oftentimes, and a skill that's probably undervalued, it's about communication and visualization of that data, right? If you have two graphs that you're making in a PowerPoint, depending on how you make them, they could tell very different stories, right? And that's part of it. And I think a lot of the companies are getting sufficient now in, hey, acquiring data and using it in a certain way. But the communication part, I believe, is key. And certainly if you're just getting started, you might not have the technical knowledge, right, to do all the data work. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to tell a story. And storytelling, right, as a skill itself, I think that's certainly important. And having the right data and information on a slide, for example, and be able to communicate that effectively to kind of the people in the organization, that's key. That's really key in today's organizations. So let's talk about, where do you start, right? What do you need to do here to actually build that skill? I think one thing that's, schools do well, most of them at least have exposure to Excel, right? And this might sound quite bad, but Excel is the starting place of anything data, right? If you have a limited amount of data, Excel is the perfect place to do things. And it really doesn't get more complicated than that. The only thing that changes is the scale and the breadth of data in an organization, but really anything that Excel can do, you can do on a larger scale in an organization. And that's often where the technical people will focus on, is how do we now apply something that we did on 15 data points, right? How do we apply that on 500 or 15,000 data points, right? That's really the scale. So for me, Excel, number one.
Okay.
Right. Number two is the visualization of the data, right? Just like you would in Excel pull a chart of the data itself. Again, that can be done on a bigger scale, right? There's tools, and we'll get back to tools in a second here, but there's tools in that space that help you do that. A key part of kind of getting more competent in the space. And then the storytelling. Now, storytelling is an area that's not directly related to data. I think storytelling itself is a discipline, right? Now, using data to build a story is what is focused on here, and I think that's another key part, right? If you see a chart, you see a set of data, how can you now get effective in that? How can you relay that to the C-suite, for example, in a company? A last one that I just want to say as more a hybrid skill is critical thinking, right? And it's about asking the question why something has a certain price, or why something has a certain attribute. I think that's really key in this space, right? If you see a data point, why is it that way? Being curious, right? Looking for answers in that space.
No, so I really appreciate that. So under data literacy, you've kind of broken it down to communication, visualization. Those two things are tying to storytelling, how to tell a story using data, and then critically analyzing and asking why we're doing things and why things are a certain way. I mean, just personally, how did you learn to tell a story using data? Was it something, of course you did? Was it you observing a manager? Was it something natural to you? How do you build that skill?
Yeah, I think that's what you often learn in the consulting space, and consulting is often frowned upon. But one thing that it does do well is it lets you make 1,000 slides for no reason and communicate a story that people need to understand. And, oftentimes in the beginning, you don't make it data driven, and you try to communicate a point and it gets challenged. And, there's no real backup you can find if there's no underlying data. You just go like, well, I don't agree. And you go like, well, I don't agree with you. Now, if you can bring data to the table, if you can say, well, no, this point is right because here, and here, we've seen this pattern, or we've seen whatever happened here, that's the moment you gain power, right? And during my consulting days, that's how we started working. And for example, say, look, in the accounting space, this number is off because of X, Y, and Z. And, this is the reasoning behind it. And here is the solution to the problem. And that really use data. So that's how I learned the skill. Takes a bit of time, because I do think in the beginning, you kind of need to go through this journey of failing and not being able to support your decision based on something that's measurable.
So to really evidence or back up your point of view and really strengthen your position. That's when that's when data comes through. Okay.
That's right. And one thing I kind of want to add to that, a lot of people think that it's easy, but I'll give you a very simple example where most companies actually struggle. So imagine you get the question in your company, how many customers do we have? Mm-hmm. Right? It's a very elementary question, and it's one that has a huge impact. But if you talk to the finance people in the organization, they might say, well, every customer, we define that as anyone that we send an invoice, right? Mm-hmm. Very, very straightforward example. But if you talk to the marketing people, probably every customer is anyone they send marketing material. So even a question as simple as give me a customer count can actually have a long winds answer and a lot of complexity in the data space to measure that correctly.
That's interesting and absolutely true. So in terms of tools, I know you mentioned Excel. I love that you kept it at Excel as a starting point, because we can, I think, all relate to Excel, and there's so many free courses where you can become, quite good in terms of using Excel. But are there any other tools for starters that people can get their head around, sort of data visualization, communication, things like that?
Yeah, that's right. So in the visualization space, I would say there's two front runners. Tableau is one, and Power BI. There are two tools that are playing in the visualization space. They both have free versions, right? They also both have 100 courses that talk about them to kind of look into that. If you look in more the hardcore data space, the data processing space, you're looking at tools like SQL, Python, R, right? They're programming languages specific for data processing. So that's an area to explore. Now, one of the skills that we do teach is maths, and data oftentimes is related with maths, and a lot of statistics and so on is involved in some of the more modern disciplines as well. So that's a good starting point if you're looking for a skill as well.
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Benedict.
Yeah, I was going to give one more honorable mention, and it's if you really get into the data game, there's a website called Kaggle, and kaggle.com, and what they do is they do competitions, and it's a free kind of, and it also has free courses, but it teaches you how to work with data and how to process it and get insights from it. So good source of information.
And is that Kaggle, Kaggle?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'll just put that on chat. So in terms of, I know you speak a lot on data. I know you're just talking about a conference and stuff you've been speaking at. If you could make some educated guesses on trends when it comes to where the world of data is kind of going, what are some things that we should generally all be aware of, particularly if we're not in the field ourselves?
Yeah, I think there used to be a big movement in this space to bring all data together in one spot. Either a data warehouse or data lake or whatever it was. But I think that movement has died. Like, people realize that data is going to be everywhere, and it's all across the organization. And so there's a lot of work that's going on for the moment in data architectures and the underlying stuff to leave data where it is, but being able to still process and access it. So it's bit complicated to explain simply, but this is an area certainly that we see grow, right? There's multiple cloud vendors, there's multiple SaaS solutions, there's multiple places where people hold and maintain data, and that will remain this way, I believe.
It's not going to be aggregated into one big
no,
big world.
We tried that for 15 years. It failed.
In terms of sort of graduates, maybe your own hiring at Collibra, how do you how do graduates showcase their skills around data confidence? Does that make a difference when you're hiring, particularly in your company?
It does. It also depends on the role, of course. Like, for example, right, I hire a lot of sales profiles, and salespeople in general need to be able to communicate with data, not only to the customer, but also internally. Like, what's their pipeline and how much is it worth and all those kind of things. So there's an expectation there that they do understand data to a certain degree. Now, if you look at more what I would call hardcore data jobs, right, data processing and science and so on, a lot of the times people are looking at math skills, right? So anything you can highlight on kind of statistics or advanced mathematics, that's great, right? One thing I would recommend, if you don't have a major or minor in data, is to do some online courses. And Coursera, for example, an online education platform, is a good source. They have quite a few courses that talk about data and how to use it. And then it really depends on what area you want to work in, right? If, again, more the real data space or the communication space, that will dictate what courses you should be following to kind of build your skill there. But I would certainly mention them on resumes. I don't see them enough, I think, on resumes. It shows that you kind of continue education, which is a big thing in the data space because it evolves constantly, right? And it shows eagerness as well. So I believe they're a good thing to add.
So even if you're studying nothing related to maths and stats, if you can show that you've done a short course on Coursera, that still counts.
For me, it certainly does, because it also shows about the personality of the person you're talking to and their approach to learning new skills.
And Josh had a question come through on data lakes and warehouses being on the way out. So that was the trends question, Benedict.
Yeah.
He's from a university, and he was saying his university IT department might be shocked to hear this.
Yeah, it's it's funny because are they on the way out? I don't know. There's just more of them. Like there used to be a trend where people had their own data lake, like in the organization, right, on premise, and then ultimately people started looking at the hyperscalers, the cloud vendors, right, GCP and AWS and Azure and so on, to move some of that load away from them, right? And then in the beginning, people chose one vendor and stick with it and go like, hey, we're going to move everything to one vendor. And then in the last 2 years or 3 years, every big company that I talk to would have multiple vendors. They would have, some there, some there, some there, depending on what the cheapest prices and the deals they can get. And I think that's the trend we will continue seeing. There's no clear winner in that space yet, right? And then there's a whole bunch of companies that kind of aggregate around that, right? People that allow processing on multiple clouds and querying across multiple clouds, and everything that goes into that as well. So a lot of movement with new companies there.
Josh, I hope that answered your question. Good, thumbs up. For any of you guys who are grads, if you have questions, Benedict, in terms of how you can use data, please add them onto chat, because we've got just a few more minutes before we close off. So I have, I guess, one more question in terms of from my end, Benedict. What's sort of the big lesson learned from your own, and this is more career, your own experience, the big lessons learned in terms of your own career for grads going into the world of work? It's very competitive, it's global. We were just talking about having a global career. There's so many opportunities, but there's also lots of challenges, like the simplest being sometimes time zones. What are some of the big lessons for you that maybe you could share with some of those that are just going into this space?
Yeah, I think don't focus on technology because it changes every 2 years. So it's really not beneficial to link yourself to one specific platform or to one specific technology, because you'll be out of date in 2 years' time. I think there's two things that I find really hard to find in the workforce, and that's one is somebody that has the combination of a technical and a business skill, and can actually talk to business people about their topic. Let's say it's accounting or supply chain or whatever it is, but also understands the technical landscape and how to use it to actually achieve results. I think that's one thing I'm missing. So my recommendation there is try to understand what companies do. And that sounds very simple, but it's a very hard thing. Like if in a lot of interviews, I would ask, for example, hey, you're going to a mining company. What are their problems, right? What is a typical mining problem? And there's very few people that think that way, right? You need to be able to do the same if you go like, hey, you're going to a major retailer, like say in Amazon, their supply chain team, like what are their challenges that they have, right? It's that's a very hard skill to find. So understanding the core of the business and how businesses work and what their challenges are, for me, is the number one thing where people are still struggling.
And to find that out, is it pure research, Benedict, or do you sort of recommend reaching out to people maybe within that company, trying to do some sort of informational interview?
Yeah, it's not always it's not company specific, of course. So it's somebody in the industry, and these days YouTube is a great source of information, and in my opinion, you can't know everything, and that's okay. But as long as you're able to get the information quickly enough to actually be effective, I think that's the big thing. So if you don't understand what a mining company does, or let's say how they operate their trucks in a mine, there's videos on it, and let's have a look at it.
Okay. I love that a lot of your recommendations are free and open source, so it's fabulous.
All information is available open. So there's nothing that people can teach for a price that's not available online in this space.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, I want to sort of maybe bring it to a close. Bent, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. We'd like to keep these short and sharp, and I think we've covered so much. In terms of, if I could summarize what you've said, so in terms of data literacy, those key skills underlying that around communication, visualization, storytelling, and critical thinking being really important. As a basic skill, get your head around Excel. If you start there, that's a good point. But also, as you were saying, in terms of the graduates coming into the workforce, being able to bridge the gap between technical and business, and then really being able to understand what companies do. So if graduates kind of take some of those tips on, and I think they'll be in a good place. And I think there's a comment on chat, Dan, I tell my dad you can find anything on the internet. Yes, anything. Good or bad.
Absolutely anything. For the better or the worse.
Better or worse. But yeah, Benedict, thank you so much for your time, everyone. Thank you again for our Lunch and Learn. Our next topic next month is around internships and volunteering. So if you're interested, please keep an eye on the newsletter. But otherwise, Benedict, wishing you all the best in your career, in your move to Melbourne, and your expansion of Collibra. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.